We are going to continue the conversation on refugees with Leah Kreitzman, who is London's Mayoral Director for External and International Affairs. And there she is, Leah. Thank you. Edmonton Mayor Don Iveson. Mr. Mayor, thank you for joining us. And Fayrouz Saad, who is the Director of Immigrant Affairs in the Mayoral Office for Detroit. Thank you so much for being here. Wow, that was a pretty special project that those two young men have going on. But let's talk more broadly. For a city that wants to be open, that wants to accept refugees, what is the biggest challenge in making it work once they arrive? Leah?
There are several different challenges, and some of them are around the integration, the practicalities around integration, the services, meeting the needs of refugee communities, of individual refugees, but also the challenges around the wider community and really seeing that integration as an everyone issue. It's not just about refugees or new migrant groups, it's everyone in the city. Another challenge that London and other big cities have is trying to integrate refugees into a situation where there's an acute housing crisis already, where there's demand outstrips supply on school places, on health services, on housing. So there are a lot of challenges that no mayor, no city hall can address themselves. It needs to be something done with civil society, with the community, with business, because obviously refugees need jobs like anyone else. And with central government. In our case in London, it's central government and local authorities that really step up when it comes to refugee resettlement, and what we do from the Mayor's office is try and facilitate and support that process.
Mayor Iveson?
Well, I think in Canadian terms, the question for Syrian refugees arrived at an interesting time because we were 6 weeks out from our own federal election last year. And then, of course, there was that horrifying picture of Alan Kurdi washed up on the beach, and he was on the way to a Canadian city. And that galvanized a conversation. And so the most difficult part for our country was a soul-searching discussion about our place in the world. And I can tell you, not on behalf of the Prime Minister, because I don't work for him, but according to Justin Trudeau, Canada is back. And so the galvanizing question for us was, how far can we go? How ambitious should we be? And ultimately, the question was settled through our election that we should be as generous as possible and bring as many people as we could. And the goal was 25,000 people by the end of last year. And they didn't quite make it, but we've gone far past 25,000 into this year, and our cities are better for it.
Fayrouz, what are the biggest challenges in the Detroit context?
Yeah, in the city of Detroit, it's very unique because while the Detroit area has been resettling refugees for decades, the city of Detroit actually hasn't had many resettled refugees in quite some time. And so there was the challenge of rebuilding that partnerships and really thinking about what that structure and infrastructure looked like to engage everyone from the state government, the federal government, the resettlement agencies who work directly to resettle the refugees, and then really thinking thoughtfully and mindfully about where within the city of Detroit makes the most sense for resettlement, and then challenges arise in what neighborhoods make the most sense. How do you identify adequate housing within the city that is ready and to be moved into? And then just integration into the rest of the city and city services.
The figures that I've seen is that as of last summer, more Syrian refugees have settled in Michigan than any other state. Is that through policy or is that organic? Networks get created once people arrive, and you also have a large Arab American population, Hamtramck, I guess, kind of right outside the city, but certainly one of the largest in the U.S., if not the largest in the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a little bit of both. And so the way the resettlement process happens within the U.S. is that it is an agreement, kind of a negotiated agreement between the State Department and resettlement agencies, which are independent nonprofit organizations, which actually resettle refugees on the ground. And they decide and discuss with their state coordinators and then the State Department on how many to accept, where to accept them from, and then where to resettle them within their areas. And so when thinking about this, they think about the ability of the local communities to absorb these new neighbors and these new residents. And so a big piece of that is the community that already exists and what is the infrastructure already set up. And so within the Detroit area, with the large Arab American community that exists, it makes a lot of sense to have Syrians resettle in that area, because then what happens is that if they're resettled in another part of the US, you see a lot of second migration. So kind of like you're saying, kind of the networks, people hear about them, immigrant communities, even if you don't have a brother or sister or uncle already here, somehow that information gets to you. And so they eventually find their ways to the Detroit area.
Yeah. One more question about Detroit specifically, which is your governor was very cool to this process, right? He called for ending resettlement. Doesn't have the power to stop it, but how did that affect how things unfolded in Detroit?
Well, so, and I won't go into too much about the governor. He called for a pause. Which was a different thing, but nevertheless, I mean, the biggest thing what happens is that it affects the narrative, and then it affects the welcoming environment that you're otherwise trying to build. And so, again, within the city in which we were really exploring on how to do this for the first time in a really long time, it was really important to kind of work directly with our partners and ensure that Mayor Duggan took a much different approach. And that's been key, is when you have the leadership of your mayor and your elected official, it really kind of helps support your work.
Mr. Mayor, can I ask you, is accepting refugees, particularly in numbers, only an act of goodwill? Is it an act of charity, or is it something that you see as benefiting the city and the population that was already there?
It's both. It's the humanitarian thing to do, but beyond the emotional argument for why it's the right thing to do in a particular news cycle with heartbreaking imagery, you have to actually sustain that as a way of life, and you have to sustain policy and resources. And the reason why it's beneficial is that Canada, though very vast in space, is actually very small in population, around 35 million people, 70+% of which live in our cities, though, and as we urbanize and as those cities age, we need immigration to support, to supplement natural population growth, which would probably decline if we weren't accepting people. And so refugees are an important part of our country's immigration program. And I think about the friends I have who came over with families that were Vietnamese boat people who fled the Idi Amin oppression in Africa, or even, frankly, black Canadians who fled slavery. Our country has a long tradition of accepting oppressed people who in turn have turned around and given so much back. And to denigrate their contribution in any way with a tinge of Islamophobia or any other fear of the other is just, I was in Toronto last week and I saw a plaque that marked the occasion and location of the anti-Greek riots 100 years ago. And so there will be plaques to mark similar xenophobic responses from different communities, and yet our sense of self as Canadians is that we are built out of great diversity into a very tolerant and inclusive country, and so it adds to our identity as well as our economy and population.
Leah, do you see this accepting refugees as primarily a humanitarian gesture, or do you see benefits for the city overall?
I think that it undoubtedly is both, but I think that it's important to understand why you're doing it, because that will have impacts on how you do it. So if you see it as a humanitarian thing to do, as the right thing to do, as something that London and cities across the UK and across Europe have traditionally done, then that frames your response. So if you're focused on the humanitarian needs of the refugees, that has an impact on how you treat them once they arrive. If you're focused on purely the, say, economic benefits of having them there, that might give you a very different path. So I think whilst it undoubtedly is both the right humanitarian thing to do and economically in the interests of the city, and also in kind of deepening the city's cultural ties and connections around the world. There's lots of benefits, but I think ultimately understanding the reason why you're doing it, which is to support people in desperate need who are fleeing the worst atrocities we've seen in decades in Syria and in other parts of the Middle East. I think that's really important, because that means that the way you respond will be to address that issue, which is about their psychological needs, particularly for children, as well as their material needs.
Your boss, Mayor Khan, first Muslim elected mayor of a major Western city, he was here in the U.S. on a trip that received a lot of attention. And on that trip, he differentiated between integration and assimilation. In his op-ed in the Chicago Tribune, which I actually wrote about at the time, he warned against growing residential segregation of immigrant populations, and he said, people shouldn't have to drop their cultures and traditions when they arrive in our cities and countries. But he does urge more social integration and views that as essential to making cities work. So what is the line that you draw? I mean, what is assimilation? What is integration?
So I think there's a couple of things that are kind of important to unpick there. One is diversity and integration are not the same thing. So we have lots of very diverse cities who aren't very integrated. So London is hugely diverse, 300 languages spoken, 1 in 3 Londoners were born outside of the United Kingdom. We have huge amounts of immigration. We have kind of lots of people leaving London, traveling all over the city and the country and the world. And so we are diverse. But we've still got a way to go when it comes to integration. So this is people living genuinely interconnected lives with their neighbors, with their colleagues. So we have integration between different generations, between different races, faiths, socioeconomic backgrounds, and also that people aren't excluded because of their race, ethnicity, faith, whatever it might be. So that's the kind of thing, difference between diversity and integration.
Yes.
And then assimilation and integration is this idea that we all have different layers of identity. I mean, I'm a Londoner, I'm a Brit, I'm a European still, just. I'm Jewish, I'm a woman. All of these things, all of these layers of my identity frame who I am and how I respond to the world. And in my position, how it forms how we make public policy, as it does with the mayor. So it's important that we are interconnected, that we're representing all different types of people, different layers of identity. Assimilation, I think the challenge, and something that Sadiq has spoken about, is it says that things aren't compatible. And I think what Sadiq's election showed was Western values and Islam are compatible. That you can be a proud Muslim and a proud Brit and a proud Londoner, as he is, and that is perfectly acceptable to the majority of Londoners who, voted for him in record numbers. And I think that the difference there between integration and assimilation is really important, because what some generations of migrants have been told is assimilate. Jews were told to assimilate in the UK. And we, a couple of weeks ago, celebrated the Battle of Cable Street, the 80th anniversary that commemorated the occasion where Irish immigrants, Jews, and working-class East Londoners came together in their tens of thousands and stopped fascists marching through the East End of London. For decades, they were told to kind of not really think about that, not really commemorate that event, because it might ignite tensions again between Jewish communities and others. And now we're in a situation where we have a huge rally to support it, where we had a big event in the town hall, where we really make that a virtue, because it's an important and significant moment. And I think doing that with different cultures, celebrating them, not just tolerating them, is really what we're trying to do in London.
It's also a major event in a great William Boyd novel, by the way, that march. Can I ask you, Detroit may not have a lot of experience with refugees, but it is one of many Midwestern U.S. cities that have been focused on attracting immigrants as a way of reversing population loss. I'm wondering, going to this point about integration, social integration, what you've learned about the challenges of integrating new arrivals in general into a community like Detroit.
Yeah, so quickly on the population piece, Detroit, while has lost overall population, has gained foreign-born population. Yes. And so it's really kind of helped offset that population
and
decline.
Particularly working-age population, right?
Yes,
yeah, right.
Exactly.
Right.
And so to the integration piece, the biggest challenge really for me right now in my office and leading the work in the city of Detroit, it's really about access points within the city and to city services and resources. And that's the most important piece, I think, to integration, is that these communities feel like they're part of the fabric of the city, but also that the city government is here to work for them. And so when working with refugee resettlement, for example, we're really working through these different pieces. So helping them enroll in schools, identifying the schools that have English as second language programs, connecting them to their neighborhood police officers, connecting them to their community groups and neighborhood block clubs and things like that. So really they become a part of the fabric of the city.
Mr. Mayor, you have a program in Edmonton that really gets at this question of kind of integration in a fascinating way, dealing with kids who have a fear of water. Because I've read that there's a program about kids who have a fear of water because how they got there. And it kind of goes to some of the challenges. Talk a little bit about the way you view integrating these new communities into what's already there.
Well, we've worked closely with the many NGO agencies and civil society groups, a lot of faith-based groups from every faith you can imagine in our community sponsored refugees. And we have a government-assisted track, which is sort of fully funded by the state, and then we have what is becoming a much larger track of privately sponsored refugees. So civil society can get together, churches have done this, workplaces have done this, community associations have done this, blocks of neighbors, condo associations have done this. It's quite a marvelous thing. And raised the $30,000 or $40,000 required, found a living space and provided support for people. But it's still, though that covers the nuts and bolts of survival, there's still a need for wraparound services for families to adjust, to support the kids to be successful at school, to help the adults retool and find work. And initially, the first thing for them is language training if they need it. So those wraparound services are critically important, and they need to be trauma-informed because these folks are coming, as has been stated, out of some of the most horrifying conditions we've seen anywhere on Earth in recent memory. And so for us, Edmonton is also a four-season city. It is the northernmost major Canadian city, major North American city, and so it is a winter place. And so we actually had a winter carnival for Syrian refugee families, and it was so moving, so touching. We had folks from the Edmonton Oilers teaching these kids how to play hockey, and which is very important to Canadians, of course. So though that looks like integration, it's not a bald-faced attempt to do that. But what I want to touch on this question of integration is there's a lot of support needed for people to be able to function and be successful. But the founding idea of Canada, and most people don't understand this very well if you're not from there, is pluralism. And so it was founded out of French-speaking Quebecois people and English-speaking people from the rest of the country. And now that is a platform to build multiculturalism and pluralism on that can accommodate, in the case of my city, 80,000 self-identified Muslim Edmontonians. And they're a rich part of our community. They attend our public schools by and large. They're in our workplaces by and large. They are not they are us. And so that is, so Canadian values accommodate that not as integration, but as multiculturalism.
Let's talk about that, Leah. I mean, if you think about the politics of this, I mean, there are obviously some people who don't like to hear new languages and don't like to see signs in different languages or smell new foods. But the heart of the political concern, the political backlash, is about security. I mean, you have this question, Donald Trump Jr. rather infamously, tweeted comparing the refugee population to a bowl of Skittles. Which drew a rebuke from Skittles. But nonetheless, how do you reassure your apprehensive residents that by opening the doors to the city, you are not bringing in people who want to do them harm?
Skittles, Tic Tacs. I mean, working with
there's a whole series of candies that are alienated.
It's really important because actually the lack of integration, the telling young, and we talk about security, but really what we're talking about is radicalization of young Muslims in this context. If you're telling them that they don't fit in, that their values, the ones that their family shares, which are peaceful, are not compatible with London, with a modern Western city, then that's the real danger. Actually, social integration has many, many benefits for a city. Some are economic, lots are social, and some are around security. I think it's important not to make this just an issue about security. As I said, this is an everyone issue. This is as much about the isolation and loneliness of older people as it is about ensuring that young people aren't radicalized. But I think that this session's called Building Bridges, Not Walls, which is pointed. That's also the name of the title of the speech that Mayor Khan gave in Chicago. And it's really important that what's actually happening when you're talking about the incompatibility of these values, you're really driving a wedge in communities and you're making it much easier to target and radicalize young people. Whereas if you say, look, you can live interconnected lives with your friends who are Jewish or Christian or of no religion at all, and actually you can all get on and you can all have the same life chances as long as we do what we need to do to reduce inequalities and everything else. That's a much more positive way to address the security concerns, and I think a much better way, both in terms of kind of pragmatically achieving the results.
You're nodding. How are you dealing with that? Because
Well-
I'm sure you have heard it from some of your residents.
I painted a picture of a lovely and united Canada, but there are divisions and there is xenophobia but that said, we do have a refugee program. If November 8th goes badly, you're all welcome to come join us. In our case, I think all I'll say on this is that you can start with security as the driving narrative, or you can start with salam, which is the Arabic word for peace, and it's also hello. And if you start from there, which is I think where most Canadians and certainly most of my colleagues at the big city mayor's table started, it just shapes the debate in the positive way. So framing's important.
Well, so first of all, I mean, the facts are that 0 refugees have been radicalized or, committed a terrorist act. And the U.S. accepts 75,000 every year. And then on that note, it is the hardest security process to come by as an immigrant into the U.S. And so on average, it takes 18 to 24 months for a refugee. For one coming from the Middle East, it could take anywhere from 3 to 5 years at least.
So on balance, as a real quick final question, on balance, do you think the climate in each of your jurisdictions is becoming more or less welcoming to refugees and migrants in general?
So it's more or less welcoming to when? I mean, I think this is the thing, it's always been difficult. This idea that there was this golden age where we kind of opened our borders and opened our arms and accepted refugees just didn't exist, but traditionally we have shown that by doing that, not only do we do the right humanitarian thing, but we build stronger and better communities. I think it's really tough. The public narrative is really hard. The media narrative is difficult. So yeah, I think we're operating in very challenging circumstances.
Mr. Mayor?
I would say in our case, it's getting better on account of leadership from mayors across the country who came together and really spurred the federal government to action. And it was one of the things that helped lift Prime Minister Trudeau, our dashing Prime Minister, to government and to a stronger majority government with a mandate to double down on pluralism and inclusion.
Fayrouz, these issues are as front and center in this presidential election as they've ever been in U.S. politics, questions of American identity. How do you see the tide, the current running?
Well, locally it's much different than nationally. I mean, luckily, my mayor is incredibly open, incredibly welcoming, and so it's great to have that support coming from leadership. On a national scale, it's very different. I think what's interesting that it's done is that it's taken those that may have been counter to this narrative anyway, but may not have been speaking up against it, and kind of brought them alongside other communities. And so that's been really great to see. And, after Trump's anti-Muslim ban comment, the Jewish community, the APIA community, so on and so forth, so many communities stepped up and said, we do not stand with that.
Leah Kreitzman, Mayor Iveson, Fayrouz, Saad, thank you so much for being here with us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.